The stagecoach bucked one last time, a final complaint against the ruts and rocks of the prairie, before groaning to a halt. For a long moment, the only sound was the jangling of the harnesses and the heavy breathing of the 4 exhausted horses, their hides lathered in sweat and coated in a fine red powder that seemed to cover everything. Eleanor Whitford, who insisted her friends call her Ellie, pressed her face to the hot glass of the window. What she saw was less a town than a suggestion of one, sketched against a vast, unforgiving sky. Cottonwood Creek, Dakota Territory. The name had sounded rustic and charming in the letters from the town council. The reality was a single, wide street of raw, unpainted lumber buildings, their facades bleached to the color of bone by a sun that did not seem to know mercy. Heat shimmered in waves from the ground, distorting the shapes of a distant bluff and a lone skeletal cottonwood tree that gave the settlement its name. A relentless wind, hot as a furnace blast, swept across the plains, carrying not the scent of pine or damp earth she knew from back east, but the taste of grit and the dry, ancient smell of dust. It was a place that felt pared down to the essentials of survival and little else. A bleached cow skull impaled on a fence post at the edge of town served as a grim welcome. Its empty socket stared out at the endless sea of brittle, sun-scorched grass that the herds of longhorn cattle had trampled into submission. It was a stark reminder that here, life was a thing to be clung to, a daily struggle against an indifferent land. Ellie clutched the small reticule in her lap, her knuckles white, inside, folded neatly, was her teaching certificate and a small, sky-blue handkerchief her mother had embroidered with forget-me-nots. It felt like a relic from another world. The coach door was yanked open by a driver whose face was a mask of trail dust. End of the line. "Miss," he grunted, offering a hand that felt as rough as bark. Ellie gathered her skirts, a dark wool travel dress wholly unsuited for this climate, and descended into the swirling dust. The town, up close, was no more inviting. It consisted of a saloon with swinging doors from which spilled the tinny sound of a poorly played piano, a general store with a sagging porch, a blacksmith's forge that rang with the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil, and a handful of other buildings in various states of completion. There was no train, no telegraph office. Cottonwood Creek was an island in a dusty ocean, connected to the rest of the world only by the rutted track the stagecoach followed. "You must be the new schoolmarm." The voice was low and gravelly, with a note of amusement that was not unkind. Ellie turned to see a woman standing on the porch of the largest building, which identified itself as Collins's boarding house, with letters painted in a faded, peeling blue. The woman was broad in the shoulder and hip, her face a roadmap of hard-won experience, but her eyes were sharp and intelligent. She wiped her hands on her apron, leaving a streak of flour. "May Collins, I own the place. You'll be staying here." It was not a question. "Eleanor Whitford," Ellie replied, trying to keep her voice from trembling. "It is a pleasure." May Collins gave a short, dry laugh. "We'll see about that. The pleasure. I mean, this ain't Philadelphia. Come on inside, child. Get out of that sun before you bake." The boarding house was dim and blessedly cooler than the street. It smelled of yeast, boiled coffee, and lye soap. May led her to a small, clean room at the back of the first floor, furnished with a narrow iron bed, a washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and a single, straight-backed chair. "It isn't much," May said, "but the mattress is corn husk, not straw, and the roof only leaks when the wind comes from the north." "It is perfect," Ellie said, her voice filled with a gratitude that was entirely genuine. She set her bag on the bed and finally pulled the blue handkerchief from her reticule, dabbing at the perspiration on her brow. The delicate blue fabric seemed impossibly fragile in this world of raw wood and iron. It was her last tangible piece of her mother, a woman who had believed education and kindness could bloom anywhere, even in the hardest soil. Ellie intended to prove her right. After washing the worst of the dust from her face and hands, Ellie ventured back out into the town's oppressive heat. She needed to understand the place that was to be her new home. Men in dusty hats watched her pass, their gazes lingering. Women, scurrying between the store and their small clapboard houses, offered tight, fleeting smiles but did not stop to speak. The air itself felt thick with unspoken tensions, a quiet watchfulness that set her nerves on edge. Nailed to a post outside the marshal's office was a freshly printed notice. The paper was still white, a stark contrast to the weathered wood behind it, in bold black letters. It announced a public land auction. Parcels of prairie, sectioned off by number and range, were to be sold to the highest bidder by order of the territorial government. It spoke of progress, of settlement, of taming the wilderness. Yet as Ellie read the legalistic language, she overheard two men leaning against the building, their voices low and conspiratorial. "Pike says the Platte and Northern will be buying up most of it," one of them muttered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice that sizzled in the dust. "Lays the track right through the valley." "What about the Sioux?" the other asked. "What about 'em? Dwyer will keep 'em quiet. Besides, here they've been rustling again, stirring up trouble over on the Redwater. It's their own fault if they get moved on." Ellie felt a chill despite the heat. Trouble. The word was dropped so casually, a justification for taking land that had belonged to others for centuries. She looked up and saw the two men whose conversation she'd interrupted. One was a large, broad-shouldered man with a silver star pinned to his vest and a heavy pistol strapped to his hip. His face was weathered and hard, his eyes the color of a winter sky. This had to be Marshal Caleb Dwyer, the local law. The man beside him was his opposite, slender, dressed in a tailored city suit, his face smooth and his smile easy, though it did not reach his eyes. He held a silver-tipped cane. "May we help you?" Miss the well-dressed man asked, his voice smooth as silk. His name, she guessed, was Pike. He represented the railroad. He represented the future, or at least one version of it. "I was just reading the notice," Ellie said, forcing a polite smile. "I am the new teacher, Eleanor Whitford." Marshal Dwyer merely grunted, his gaze dismissive. But Silas Pike tipped his hat. "A pleasure. Miss Whitford, a center of learning is a fine thing for a growing community. Silas Pike, an agent for the Platte and Northern Railroad. We believe in building communities." He gestured with his cane toward the vast, empty prairie. "Soon, this will all be civilized." The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Civilized. Ellie wondered what he meant by it. Did it mean displacing the people who already lived here? Before she could form a reply, a gentle voice spoke from behind her, and the Lord said, "Let there be light." "It seems he has sent it in the form of you, Miss Whitford." She turned to see a man with kind eyes and a slightly stooped posture, wearing the simple black coat of a clergyman. "Reverend Hale," he said, extending a hand. "Welcome to Cottonwood Creek. We have been praying for your safe arrival." His warmth was a balm after the cold assessment of the other two men. "Thank you, Reverend. I am very glad to be here. I understand you are looking for a place to hold your school," the Reverend continued, steering her gently away from the marshal's office. "The town council has offered the old abandoned church at the edge of town. It is not much, but it is sturdy." As they walked, leaving Pike and Dwyer to their quiet plotting, the Reverend spoke of the town and its people. He spoke of the harsh winters and the long droughts, of the hopes and fears of the settlers. "There is good in this town, Miss Whitford," he said earnestly. "But there is fear, too. Fear of the land, fear of the unknown, and fear of the Lakota." "I was told my position would involve teaching all the children of the area," Ellie said carefully. "That includes the Lakota children, does it not?" Reverend Hale's kind face clouded over. "That is my hope. It is the Christian thing to do. But many of the townsfolk, they do not agree. They see the Lakota as a threat, not as neighbors." It was then that she saw him. A rider was coming down the center of the street, moving with a fluid grace that made the horse and man seem like a single being. He was not a townsman. He was Lakota. He sat tall and straight on a painted pony, his black hair long and tied back with a simple leather thong. He wore buckskin trousers and a plain cotton shirt, and he carried no weapon that she could see. Yet he possessed an aura of profound stillness, of self-containment, that was more commanding than any pistol. As he drew near, the already sparse foot traffic on the street seemed to melt away. Doors closed quietly, conversations ceased. The rhythmic hammering from the blacksmith's forge, which had been the town's constant heartbeat, fell silent. The silence was heavy, thick with hostility and mistrust. The man on the horse seemed not to notice. His gaze swept over the town, not with aggression, but with a calm, assessing vigilance. He saw everything: the new notice on the marshal's post, the well-dressed railroad man, the new woman standing beside the reverend. For a fleeting second, his eyes met Ellie's. They were dark and deep, and in them, she saw not the savagery that townsfolk whispered of, but an ancient intelligence, a deep-seated weariness, and a flicker of something she could only describe as guarded sorrow. He held her gaze for a heartbeat longer than was comfortable, a silent acknowledgement, before he looked away and continued on, riding through the town and out the other side, disappearing back into the shimmering heat of the prairie from which he had come. He left behind a silence that was more profound than his passing. "Who was that?" Ellie whispered, her heart beating a little faster. "That is Chaska," Reverend Hale said, his voice low. "He used to scout for the salt caravans. He speaks English better than many men in this town. He is a man of honor, but he walks a difficult path. He tries to protect his people, and the world keeps changing under his feet." The hammer began to ring again from the forge, and the piano in the saloon tentatively picked up its tune. The spell was broken. But the image of the rider, his calm dignity in the face of the town's silent animosity, remained burned into Ellie's mind. She looked down at her hands, at the delicate blue handkerchief she still held. Hope. It felt like such a small, fragile thing to bring to a land of red dust and hard eyes, a land where a cow's skull was a landmark and a man's honor was a burden. A storm was coming to Cottonwood Creek. She could feel it in the hot, gritty wind, a gathering of forces she did not yet understand but knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she would be standing in the middle of it. A week passed in a haze of red dust and introductions. Ellie spent her days at the old church, a drafty, cavernous building that smelled of dust and forgotten hymns. With the help of the town blacksmith, a burly Irishman named O'Rourke, whose gentle hands seemed at odds with his powerful frame, she scrubbed the floors, patched the roof, and built crude but sturdy benches. Her determination was a source of quiet amusement and grudging respect among the townsfolk. They saw the slight woman from the East, with her proper grammar and impractical dresses, waging a determined war against the accumulated neglect of a decade, and they did not know what to make of it. May Collins, for her part, had a small homestead a few miles outside of town where she kept chickens and a milk cow. She insisted Ellie join her for Sunday dinner, a welcome respite from the bland fare at the boarding house. The trip required borrowing May's buckboard and a steady old mule named Beatrice. On the return journey, as the afternoon sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and purple, Ellie felt a flicker of peace. The prairie, for all its harshness, possessed a stark and lonely beauty. The wind whispered through the tall grass, a sound like a distant ocean, and for a moment she allowed herself to believe that her mother had been right. Kindness could bloom here. She was guiding Beatrice through Dry Gulch, a narrow passage where the prairie floor dipped between two steep rocky bluffs, when that fragile peace was shattered. The place was aptly named. It was a scar on the land, choked with loose rock and thorny scrub. The high walls cast long, distorted shadows that danced like specters in the fading light, and the acoustics of the place had the unsettling effect of making the creak of the wagon wheels and Beatrice's plodding hooves sound unnaturally loud. It felt like the throat of the land, and Ellie suddenly felt it constricting around her. The first gunshot cracked through the air, echoing off the rock walls like a whip. Beatrice brayed in terror and reared up, her eyes wide with panic. Ellie clung to the reins, her heart leaping into her own throat. More shots followed, not aimed at her, but fired into the sky. A cacophony of explosions designed to terrify. From the rocks above, figures emerged. There were 4 of them, their faces hidden by rough-spun hoods, their bodies cloaked in dusty ponchos. They whooped and yelled, a chaotic and ugly sound that was a crude imitation of something they clearly were not. The buckboard slewed sideways as Beatrice tried to bolt. A bag of flour and a sack of sugar May had sent back with her tumbled out and burst open, spilling white powder across the red earth. One of the hooded men leaped down into the gully, landing with a soft thud. He grabbed the mule's bridle, bringing the panicked animal to a shuddering halt. Ellie sat frozen on the wagon seat, her hands gripping the reins so tightly her knuckles ached. They did not approach her. Instead, they moved with a strange, theatrical purpose, kicking over the spilled supplies and scattering them further. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone, scrambling back up the rocks and vanishing into the twilight. A final, parting shot echoed down the gulch. In their wake, they left a profound silence, a cloud of settling dust, and several arrows stuck in the ground around the wagon, their feathers quivering in the still air. Ellie's breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. She remained motionless for a full minute, her mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. They had not tried to harm her. They had not tried to rob her of her purse. They had only sought to frighten her, to create a scene of chaos and destruction. Why? A pebble skittered down the rock face to her left. Ellie flinched, her eyes darting toward the sound. A figure was descending, not with the clumsy haste of the attackers, but with the silent, deliberate grace of a shadow. It was Chaska. He moved without a sound, his moccasins finding purchase on the treacherous scree as if he were walking on flat ground. He carried a bow, but it was unstrung and held loosely in one hand. His eyes were not on her, but were scanning the rocks above, his expression one of intense, focused concentration. He reached the floor of the gully and approached the buckboard. Beatrice, who had been trembling violently, suddenly grew calm under his steady gaze. He said nothing, but simply stood beside the animal, one hand resting gently on its neck. Only when he seemed satisfied that the danger had passed did he turn his attention to Ellie. "Are you harmed?" he asked. His voice was low and calm, a steadying anchor in the swirling sea of her fear. She could only shake her head, unable to find her voice. He nodded once. Then his gaze fell upon the arrows protruding from the ground. He walked over to the nearest one and pulled it from the earth. He held it not by the shaft, but by the fletching, his fingers examining the feathers, his thumb testing the arrowhead, which had been crudely chipped from a piece of flint. He turned the shaft over and over, his dark eyes missing nothing. A faint, almost imperceptible frown creased his brow. "This is not the work of my people," he said, his voice flat and certain. He held the arrow out for her to see. "The shaft is young pine. It is soft and will warp. We use seasoned ash or dogwood. The feathers are from a chicken. The arrowhead is poorly made. This is a child's toy, or a white man's idea of an arrow." He snapped the flimsy shaft over his knee with a sharp crack and tossed the pieces to the ground in disgust. Ellie finally found her tongue. "But who? Why would they do this? They were dressed to look—" She trailed off, the implication hanging in the air. "They were dressed to make you believe what Marshal Dwyer will want you to believe," Chaska said. He looked at her, his gaze direct and unflinching. "They want you to be afraid. They want the town to be afraid." His words seemed to clear a fog in her mind. It was not a random act of violence. It was a performance, a carefully staged lie. She slid down from the wagon seat, her legs unsteady. As she knelt to gather her spilled belongings, her hands trembling, her fingers brushed against the rough burlap of the broken sugar sack. There, half obliterated by dust and the sticky sugar, was a stenciled marking. It was a simple diamond shape, and inside it were 2 letters and a symbol, P and N, Platte and Northern. She stared at it, her blood running cold. Silas Pike, the railroad, the land auction, it was all connected. This was not about her. This was about the land. They were manufacturing a threat to drive the price down, to scare settlers into selling for pennies on the dollar to the company that promised safety and civilization. Chaska saw the direction of her gaze. He knelt beside her, his eyes following hers to the marking on the sack. He did not need to ask. His expression hardened, the sorrow in his eyes momentarily replaced by a cold, hard anger. "Now you see," he said softly. He helped her right the buckboard and gather what few supplies were salvageable. He calmed Beatrice with a few soft words in his own tongue and checked her harnesses. As they prepared to leave the shadowed confines of the gulch, he turned to her. "Do not trust Marshal Dwyer," he warned, his voice low and urgent. "He is a man who serves power, not justice. His law is not meant to protect you or my people. It is meant to protect men like Pike." The journey back to Cottonwood Creek was made in a tense silence. The sight of the buckboard limping into town, with Ellie pale and disheveled and Chaska walking grimly alongside, brought people out of their homes and businesses. Whispers followed them down the street like a swarm of insects. Marshal Caleb Dwyer met them in front of the boarding house, his face a mask of performative outrage. "Miss Whitford, are you all right? We heard shots. What happened?" His eyes flicked to Chaska, and his hand instinctively dropped to the butt of his pistol. Before Ellie could speak, Dwyer saw the broken arrows in the back of the wagon. He snatched one up. "Just as I thought," he boomed, holding it aloft for the gathering crowd to see. The work of savages, an unprovoked attack on a defenseless woman. This is what happens when we allow them to roam so close to town. "That is not true," Ellie began, her voice shaking but firm. "They were not—" Dwyer cut her off, his voice overriding hers. "I am forming a posse immediately. We will hunt these renegades down and make an example of them. This town will be made safe." He turned and stomped toward his office, shouting for deputies, the crowd parting before him. The narrative was set. The lie had been told, and the town, gripped by a fear that had been so expertly manufactured, was eager to believe it. Later that evening, Silas Pike paid a visit to the boarding house. He brought a small bouquet of wilting prairie flowers and an expression of deep concern. "My dear Miss Whitford," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "I was horrified to hear what happened. A terrible, terrible ordeal. It only goes to show how dangerous this territory remains. It is why the Platte and Northern is so committed to bringing order and security. In fact," he added, leaning in conspiratorially, "I have been speaking with some of the local ranchers. In light of this recent unrest, they are feeling quite vulnerable. A few are even considering selling their land at a very reasonable price to move somewhere safer. A wise decision, perhaps." Ellie looked at his smooth, untroubled face, and she felt a wave of nausea. He was a vulture, circling a carcass of his own making. The attack, the fear, Dwyer's posse, it was all a part of his plan. She was just a pawn, a convenient excuse. Her idealism, the simple belief in goodness and education she had brought with her from the East, felt like a fool's dream. She was caught between the raw, undisguised power of men like Dwyer and the subtle, smiling poison of men like Pike, and standing against them was Chaska, a man who saw the truth but was condemned by a world that refused to listen. She was afraid, more afraid than she had been in the gully. But underneath the fear, a new feeling was taking root, a cold, quiet, and unyielding anger. The fabricated story of the attack on the schoolteacher spread through Cottonwood Creek like a prairie fire, fanned by Marshal Dwyer's blustering pronouncements and the quiet, insidious whispers of Silas Pike's agents. Dwyer's posse rode out with a great show of force, spent 2 days chasing shadows on the plains, and returned empty-handed, declaring the renegades had fled into the deep territory. The result was exactly what Pike had intended. A low-grade fever of fear settled over the town, making folks look at the vast, empty horizon with a new and profound suspicion. It was into this simmering pot of anxiety that Eleanor Whitford chose to open her school. The day after the incident in Dry Gulch, she walked to the old church, her back straight and her resolve hardened into a cold, clear purpose. The fear they had tried to plant in her had taken root. But instead of paralyzing her, it had flowered into defiance. She would not be their pawn. She would not be driven off by a lie. The first day, only 6 children came. They were the sons and daughters of the blacksmith O'Rourke, the Reverend Hale, and a few other families who either didn't believe Dwyer's story or believed a primer was more important than a rumor. They sat on the new benches in the cavernous, echoing space, their eyes wide, watching Ellie as she wrote the alphabet on a large slate propped on an easel. On the third day, they were joined by 3 more students. They did not come through the front door. They slipped in through a back entrance, the one with a broken latch, moving with a silence that made the floorboards seem not to notice their weight. They were Lakota children, 2 girls with shy eyes and a boy whose gaze was bright and impossibly curious. The boy's name, Ellie would learn, was Natan. He watched her every move, his focus absolute, as if he were trying to memorize not just the letters she drew, but the very way her hand moved through the air. The white children stared. The Lakota children stared back. For a long, tense moment, the only sound was the sighing of the wind through a crack in the church's steeple. Then Ellie smiled, a warm, genuine smile that did not demand a response, and turned back to the slate. "This letter," she said, her voice calm and even, it is the beginning of many things." From that day on, a silent watcher often took up a position on a low ridge several hundred yards from the church. Chaska would sit with his horse, a still and patient silhouette against the brassy sky. He was not spying, he was guarding. He watched the children arrive, and he watched them leave, his presence a quiet and unspoken promise that what happened in Dry Gulch would not happen here. The peace, however, was fragile. It took less than a week for the complaints to begin. A formidable woman whose husband owned the general store confronted Ellie on the street, her face pinched with indignation. "It is not right," she declared, her voice loud enough for half the town to hear. "Mixing them in with our own. It's not clean. It's not safe. After what they did to you." "What happened to me had nothing to do with them," Ellie replied, her own voice quiet but firm. "They are children, and they deserve to learn, just as yours do." The woman scoffed and turned away. But the seed of dissent was sown. The next day, Marshal Dwyer paid a visit to the school. He filled the doorway, his bulk blocking out the light, his silver star gleaming. He did not remove his hat. "Miss Whitford," he began, his tone heavy with official authority, "I am receiving complaints about this arrangement for the sake of public order. I cannot have this sort of thing stirring up trouble. You will send the native children home. It is for the best." "The town council hired me to teach all the children of Cottonwood Creek," Ellie countered, stepping in front of her students, who had fallen silent at the sight of the marshal. "These children live here. I will not turn them away." Dwyer's eyes narrowed. "This is not a request, it is a warning. I will maintain order in this town, one way or another." He gave a pointed look at Natan, then turned and left, the floorboards groaning under his weight. That evening, Silas Pike approached her as she sat on the boarding house porch, trying to catch a non-existent breeze. He was all smooth charm and tailored wool, a stark contrast to the rough-hewn town. He offered her a glass of lemonade May had made, a difficult business, molding young minds. He began, his voice sympathetic, especially in such a challenging environment. "I admire your fortitude." He took a sip of his drink. "Which is why I want to make you an offer. The Platte and Northern is building a new town 20 miles east of here, right on the line. It will be a proper town, a mayor, a bank, a hotel, and a brand new schoolhouse, built with milled lumber from Chicago. We will need a first-rate teacher. The salary would be triple what this dusty little council is paying you. It would be a safe, respectable position. All you would have to do is agree to take it and, in the meantime, perhaps close this current experiment. Avoid any further trouble." It was a bribe, wrapped in a compliment. He was offering her a golden cage. All she had to do was abandon Natan and the others, to concede that some children were worth less than others. She looked at his smiling face, and she saw the same calculated emptiness she had seen in the eyes of the cow's skull at the edge of town. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Pike," she said, her voice as cool and level as she could make it, "but my work is here." Pike's smile tightened for a fraction of a second. "A pity," he said, and finished his lemonade. "A great pity." As the days wore on, Ellie's conversations with the silent guardian on the ridge grew from brief greetings into something more. After the children had gone home, Chaska would sometimes walk his horse down to the church. He would ask about Natan, about what he was learning. He listened intently as Ellie explained the sounds of the letters, the shapes of the numbers. In return, he answered her own questions. He taught her the Lakota word for the wind that never ceased, for the sun that baked the earth. One afternoon, she heard him humming a soft, mournful tune. When she asked about it, he fell silent for a long time. "It was my mother's song," he finally said, his gaze fixed on the distant bluffs. "It is about the river that used to run through that valley, the one we called the Greasy Grass. The white men call it the Little Bighorn now. They changed the names of everything." He told her how the traders and the army had diverted the smaller creeks to feed their forts and settlements, how the water no longer flowed where the ancestors had known it would. The land was being changed, its very veins being cut and rerouted to serve new masters. His words were simple, spoken without self-pity, but they carried the weight of generations of loss. In his stories of the rivers, Ellie heard the story of his people. The irony was not lost on her when the town's own water supply began to fail. The summer deepened, the heat growing more intense, more personal in its oppression. The sky remained a vast, cloudless bowl of blue. The town well, the single source of water for most of the inhabitants, grew shallow. The water that came up in the buckets was brackish and warm, with a metallic taste. Tempers, already frayed by fear, grew shorter. Fights broke out in the saloon. May began rationing water at the boarding house. The land itself seemed to be turning against them. Ellie, ever practical, refused to simply wait for rain. She went to O'Rourke the blacksmith. "If we could dig a ditch from the low ground near the creek bed," she reasoned, "we might find the water table. It would be closer to the surface there." The blacksmith wiped sweat from his brow with the back of a brawny arm, leaving a streak of soot. He looked at the cracked, baked earth. "It is a fool's errand, miss, but I've never known a little sweat to kill a man." And so they began. For 2 days, Ellie, O'Rourke, and a few other hopefuls labored under the punishing sun, their shovels ringing against baked clay and rock. They made agonizingly slow progress, a shallow, dusty trench that looked more like a grave than a channel for life-giving water. The effort was a testament to their desperation. On the afternoon of the second day, Chaska appeared. He did not ride down from the ridge but seemed to materialize from the shimmering heat haze at the edge of town. He watched them for a time, his expression unreadable as they toiled, their movements sluggish in the oppressive heat. He walked the length of their pathetic ditch, his eyes on the ground. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away from them, toward a small, dense thicket of willows that everyone else had ignored. The willows were greener than the surrounding scrub, their leaves not yet curled and brown. He stopped, pushed aside a branch, and pointed to the ground at his feet. O'Rourke leaned on his shovel, breathing heavily. "What is it, man? We're busy here." Chaska did not reply. He simply knelt, and with his bare hands, he began to scrape away the dry topsoil. A few inches down, the earth was dark and cool. It was damp. A murmur went through the small group of diggers. O'Rourke and Ellie hurried over. The blacksmith plunged his shovel into the spot Chaska had indicated. It sank in with a soft, sucking sound. He lifted a shovelful of dark, rich mud. He dug again and again. On the fourth scoop, water, clear and cold, began to seep into the bottom of the hole. It was an old spring, one the land remembered even if the people had forgotten. A ragged cheer went up. For a moment, there was no town, no tribe, no conflict. There were only thirsty people, standing at the edge of a miracle, watching life well up from the heart of the earth. Later that night, a storm of a different kind broke over Reverend Hale. He was reading in his small study at the back of the parsonage when he heard a soft thud against his door. He opened it to find the porch empty, the street dark and silent. But lying on the welcome mat was a rolled-up tube of oilcloth, tied with a piece of twine. He brought it inside and unrolled it on his desk under the warm glow of his oil lamp. It was a map. It was not a government survey map, but a crudely drawn but meticulously detailed schematic. It showed the existing town of Cottonwood Creek, and it showed the route of the Platte and Northern Railroad. But the line on this map did not follow the officially proposed route that skirted the edge of the Lakota lands. This line, marked with the words Proposed Shortcut SP, Approval, cut a brutal, direct path straight through the heart of the sacred valley where Chaska's people held their ceremonies, the Valley of the Greasy Grass. The map was a death warrant for a way of life, and the Reverend knew, with a certainty that made him feel sick to his stomach, that the document had been given to him for a reason. He had been chosen to bear witness. The discovery of the spring changed the mood in Cottonwood Creek, at least for a time. The shared labor and its miraculous result forged a fragile bond in the heat-stricken community. For a few days, the talk in the general store was not of renegades and land prices, but of flow rates and the sweetness of the new water. O'Rourke, the blacksmith, fashioned a sturdy hand pump and built a long wooden trough where settlers and Lakota alike could fill their buckets and water their animals. It was a small island of peace in a sea of simmering mistrust, a place where the common need for water washed away. However briefly, the lines that had been drawn in the dust. This newfound harmony was not something Silas Pike or Marshal Caleb Dwyer could afford. Unity did not scare people into selling their land cheaply. It did not create the chaos necessary to justify a railroad's aggressive expansion. They watched the quiet cooperation at the trough from the shade of the marshal's office porch, their expressions curdled with impatience. The pretext they needed came in the form of a small, temporary Lakota camp that had been established near the willow thicket, a traditional summering spot for a few families. Dwyer, citing a litany of imagined complaints about sanitation and potential contamination of the new water source, declared the camp a public nuisance. He gathered 4 of his thuggish deputies, men who wore their badges as a license for cruelty, and announced his intention to peacefully relocate the families. The term was a lie. There was nothing peaceful about their arrival. They rode into the small collection of teepees like a conquering army, shouting orders and kicking over drying racks. O'Rourke was at the spring, reinforcing the base of the pump. When the commotion began, he was a man who understood the simple physics of fairness, and what he was witnessing was a gross imbalance of force. He dropped his tools and walked over, his large frame planting itself between a deputy and an old woman who was trying to gather her scattered belongings. "There is no need for this," the blacksmith said, his voice a low rumble. "These folks are doing no harm." "This is official town business." "O'Rourke," Dwyer snarled, his hand resting on his pistol. "Stay out of it." "It is bullying, is what it is," O'Rourke retorted, his Irish temper beginning to fray, "and I will not stand by and watch it." The situation deteriorated quickly. A deputy shoved O'Rourke. The blacksmith, a man of immense strength, shoved him back, sending him stumbling. In the confusion, another deputy swung his rifle butt, not at O'Rourke, but in a wide, careless arc that caught the blacksmith on the side of the head. O'Rourke staggered, a dark line of blood instantly appearing in his red hair, and fell to one knee. The women in the camp screamed. The deputies, seeing their chance, began to push and shove with more force, creating a scene of pure, chaotic panic. Ellie heard the shouting from the church. She and her students, Natan included, ran outside to see the unfolding disaster. In the swirling dust and confusion, she saw O'Rourke go down. She saw the deputies herding the terrified Lakota families like cattle. And then she lost sight of Natan. One moment he was beside her, his eyes wide with fear for his relatives in the camp. The next, he was gone. swallowed up by the chaos. By the time the dust settled, the camp was gone. The deputies had driven the families out onto the open prairie with nothing but what they could carry. O'Rourke was being helped back to town, a bloody rag pressed to his head, his face a grim mask of pain and fury, and Nathan was nowhere to be found. Panic seized Ellie, cold and sharp. She searched the area, calling his name, her voice growing more shrill with every unanswered cry. Reverend Hale helped her, his kind face etched with worry. But there was no sign of the boy. When she approached Marshal Dwyer, demanding he search for her missing student, he waved her away with a dismissive gesture. He likely ran off with his kin. The marshal grunted. Good riddance. One less mouth to feed. Ellie knew then that the law would not help her. The law was the cause of this. There was only one person she could turn to. She ran from the scene, her skirts catching on the thorny brush. Her destination fixed in her mind. She had to find Chaska. She found him on the ridge, a grim statue watching the last of his people being driven from their ancestral ground. His face, when he turned to her, was carved from stone. She told him what happened, the words tumbling out in a frantic, breathless rush. When she spoke Natan's name, the stone in his expression cracked, revealing a deep and immediate alarm. He did not waste time with questions. He dismounted, took the reins of his pony, and began to walk, his eyes sweeping the ground, reading a story in the trampled earth that was invisible to her. She followed him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He moved with an unnerving purpose, circling the area of the evicted camp, his gaze missing nothing. He paused at a spot where the earth was scuffed, where a small, bright blue bead, one Natan often wore in his hair, lay half buried in the dust. From there, the trail was clear to him. It was not the trail of a boy running to join his family. It was the trail of a struggle, of small feet being dragged away from the direction the others had been forced to go. Their search led them away from the town, toward a series of rocky, eroded ravines that cut through the prairie. It was difficult country, a maze of gullies and dry washes that would be a perfect place to hide something, or someone. As the sun began to sink, casting long, menacing shadows, Chaska held up a hand, signaling for her to stop. He had found it. Tucked away at the back of a narrow canyon was an old, dilapidated line shack, likely left over from a telegraph survey years ago. A fresh set of boot prints led to the door. Chaska moved with the silence of a hunting cat. He motioned for Ellie to stay back, then crept toward the shack. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open with the toe of his moccasin and slipped inside. Ellie, her fear warring with her desperate need to know, followed a few moments later, her footsteps loud and clumsy in the charged silence. The shack was small and smelled of dust and rodent droppings, but it was not empty. Stacked against the far wall were several large wooden crates. Chaska was standing over one, a hunting knife in his hand, which he used to pry open the lid. The screech of the nails being pulled from the wood was the loudest sound Ellie had ever heard. The crate was not filled with railroad supplies. It was filled with rifles and boxes of ammunition. Chaska moved to the next crate. He did not need his knife for this one. The lid was loose. He lifted it off. Inside, piled on top of each other in a heap of rough, brown fabric, were the hoods. The same crude, frightening hoods the men in Dry Gulch had worn, and beneath them, tied up but unharmed, his eyes wide with terror, was Natan. Ellie cried out his name and rushed forward, but Chaska stopped her with a firm hand on her arm. His other hand went to his own lips, a silent command for quiet. As he worked to untie the boy, a new sound reached them from outside the shack, the crunch of boots on gravel and the low murmur of male voices. Before they could react, the doorway was filled by the hulking form of Marshal Dwyer, a shotgun held loosely in his hands. Two of his deputies flanked him. Dwyer's eyes took in the scene. Chaska, the untied boy, the open crates of weapons and hoods. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. It was not the smile of a man who had stumbled upon a crime. It was the smile of a man whose trap had just been sprung. "Well, well," the marshal drawled, his voice thick with mock surprise. "Look what we have here. A kidnapper and an arms cache. Looks like you have been a busy man. Chaska, planning a little war, were you?" "These are your weapons, Dwyer," Chaska said, his voice dangerously calm. He stood protectively in front of Nathan and Ellie. Dwyer laughed, a short, ugly bark. "My word against yours. And I am wearing the star. You are under arrest for trespassing, kidnapping, and conspiring against the peace of this territory." He gestured with the shotgun. "Cuff him." The deputies moved in. Chaska did not resist. To do so would have been suicide, and it would have endangered Ellie and the boy. He stood tall and proud as one of the deputies roughly shoved his hands behind his back and clamped the cold, heavy iron of the handcuffs onto his wrists. The metallic click of the ratchet locking into place echoed in the small shack. It was the sound of a legal system being bent and broken, the sound of justice being locked away in the dark. They were marched back to town under guard. Natan was returned to a grateful but terrified relative who had been allowed to stay behind. Chaska was thrown into one of the 2 filthy cells in the back of the marshal's office. Ellie, shaken to her core, did the only thing she could think of. She went to see Silas Pike. She found him in the saloon, sharing a bottle of whiskey with a surveyor. He excused himself and met her on the porch, his face a perfect mask of polite concern. She told him everything she had seen: the hoods, the rifles, the stencils on the crates, the false arrest. She spoke with the desperate, earnest conviction of someone who still believed, on some fundamental level, that men in authority would respond to reason and truth. Pike listened patiently, his head tilted slightly, his expression unchanging. When she had finished, he sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. "Miss Whitford," he said, his voice gentle, as if speaking to a hysterical child, "you have been through a great deal. It is understandable that you are overwrought, but you are making wild, dangerous accusations. A secret cache of weapons, a conspiracy involving the town marshal. It sounds like something from a Penny Dreadful novel. I think you should go back to your room at the boarding house and rest. Leave matters of law and order to the men who understand them." His condescension was a slap in the face. He was not just ignoring her, he was dismissing her reality, painting her as a fragile, foolish woman who could not comprehend the world of men. The last vestiges of her faith in the system crumbled into dust. She stumbled back to the boarding house, her mind reeling. May Collins took one look at her pale face and trembling hands and steered her into the kitchen, sitting her down at the big wooden table and pouring her a cup of hot, strong coffee. Ellie told her the whole story, her voice breaking with a mixture of rage and despair. May listened without interruption, her weathered face grim, her sharp eyes missing nothing. When Ellie was done, May was silent for a long moment, staring into the depths of her own coffee cup. Then she looked up, and her expression was one she had never shown Ellie before. It was the look of a woman who had seen the worst of the world and had learned to fight back with weapons of her own. "There are other kinds of law than the one Dwyer keeps in his holster," May said, her voice low and hard, "and there are debts that go back a long way." She stood up and put on her bonnet. "You stay here and look after the place. I have to send a message." She did not say where or to whom. She simply walked out into the night, a woman with a purpose as clear and unyielding as granite. May Collins returned just before dawn, a small, determined shadow moving through the gray twilight. She did not look tired. She looked like a general after a successful, if costly, campaign. She found Ellie asleep in a chair in the boarding house kitchen, her head resting on the table next to a cold coffee cup. May placed a hand on her shoulder, and Ellie started awake, her eyes wide with a night's worth of fear. "There is a man," May explained in a low voice, "a cattle rancher named Jedediah Thorne. He runs 10,000 head of longhorn north of here. Marshal Dwyer owes him a great deal of money from a poorly considered card game some years back." "Mr. Thorne," May continued, Also owes me a favor from a time when his daughter fell ill and there was no doctor for 50 miles. A message was sent. I suggested to Mr. Thorne that it would be a shame if the marshal were too busy chasing phantoms to properly protect the thorn herds. I also suggested that a false arrest, particularly one that might draw the attention of a territorial magistrate, would be very bad for business. An hour later, as the sun's first rays touched the dusty street, the door to the marshal's office opened. Chaska was pushed out onto the boardwalk. He was not free. The charges, Dwyer had informed him with a sneer, were merely suspended pending further investigation. He was to remain near the town. He was being watched. The heavy iron cuffs were gone, but the weight of them seemed to linger, an invisible brand of accusation on his wrists. The story of his arrest and release became a poison that seeped into the foundations of the town. To those who already feared and distrusted the Lakota, it was proof of his guilt. The only reason he was walking free, the whispers in the general store went, was because of some backroom deal cut by that meddling schoolteacher. She was not just teaching their children, she was siding with them. The school suffered first. The day after Chaska's release, half the students were gone. Their parents, led by the indignant wife of the store owner, had decided they would not have their children educated by a woman who kept such questionable company. The large, echoing church felt emptier than ever. The silence between the few remaining students was a heavy, mournful thing. Ellie's heart ached as she looked at the empty benches. Each vacant spot was a small victory for Silas Pike. Reverend Hale came to see her that afternoon, his face deeply troubled. He stood in the doorway of the school, twisting his hat in his hands. He assured her of his unwavering support, of his belief in her mission. But, he confided, the town council was under pressure. 2 of its members had already suggested her contract should be terminated. They spoke of public safety, of respecting the community's wishes. The words were different, but the meaning was the same as Dwyer's and Pike's. Fall in line, or be cast out. You are doing the Lord's work, Eleanor, the Reverend said, his voice filled with a sad sincerity. But you must understand that this town is a tinderbox, and you are holding a lit match. The truth was, the match had been lit long before she arrived. She was merely standing in the light it cast, a light that revealed the ugly truths hiding in the shadows. That night, she met Chaska. He was waiting for her in the deep darkness behind the church, a place where the light from the saloon and the boarding house did not reach. He was not a man given to wasting words. He had come to a decision. The law of the white man is a tool, he said, his voice as quiet as the dust settling around them. Dwyer and Pike use it like a club. To fight them with their own laws is to volunteer for a beating. We cannot prove what they did in the ravine. It is their word against ours, and our words have no value in their courts. Then what can we do? Ellie asked, a note of desperation in her voice. The school is failing. They are turning everyone against us. There is only one thing they fear, Chaska replied. They do not fear the truth. They fear being exposed. Pike is a careful man, but he is also arrogant. Men like him believe they are untouchable. They keep records. It is how they track their power. Ellie looked at him, her mind racing. The map, she thought. The map the Reverend had shown her. He has a ledger, Chaska continued, confirming her thoughts. A book. In it, he writes down the names of the men he pays, the money he spends to create his chaos. He keeps it with his survey maps and contracts in a small supply cabin they have built near the new railhead, miles from town. He believes it is safe there. How do you know this? She whispered. I have watched them. I have listened when they thought no one was near. He said it as a simple statement of fact. Observation was his weapon, the one they could not take from him. If we had that book, he said, looking at her directly, his dark eyes seeming to hold the entire night sky in their depths. If we could show it to the people of this town, to men like O'Rourke and even to the fearful ones on the council, then the story would change. Pike's lies would have no power against his own handwriting. It was a desperate, dangerous plan. The railhead was heavily guarded by men on the railroad's payroll, Men loyal to Pike, not the law. "I will go with you," Ellie said, the words leaving her lips before she had fully considered them. The decision was not born of logic, but of a deep, visceral need to act, to push back against the suffocating weight of the injustice that was crushing them all. Chaska shook his head. "It is too dangerous. You have already risked too much." She stepped closer to him, her chin lifted in defiance. "It was my student they took. It is my school they are trying to destroy. It is my name they are dragging through the mud. This is my fight, too. Besides," she added, a touch of her schoolteacher's practicality returning, "you might need someone who can read his records quickly." He was silent for a long time, studying her face in the faint starlight. He saw not the frightened woman from Dry Gulch, but a person whose ideals had been forged into something harder, something more resilient. In the fires of the last few weeks, he gave a single, reluctant nod. They left an hour before midnight, slipping out of the sleeping town like ghosts. The wind had picked up, a low, mournful sigh that swept across the plains, carrying the scent of dust and distance. It was a moonless, star-dusted night, the kind of profound darkness that felt like a tangible thing. A black velvet cloak dropped over the world, instead of taking the open prairie. Chaska led her down into the dry creek bed that snaked its way east. It was slower going, the soft sand and loose gravel shifting under their feet, but it offered cover, a sunken road hidden from any of Dwyer's patrols that might be riding the ridges. They moved in silence for the first hour, the only sounds the soft scuff of their footsteps and the constant, whispering rush of the wind. The darkness and the shared danger created a strange intimacy, a sense of being the only two people alive in a vast, sleeping world. It was in this bubble of quiet that they began to talk, their voices low, weaving a connection in the dark. "What is it you are truly fighting for, Chaska?" she asked, her voice barely more than a breath. "Is it just the land?" He considered the question as he walked, his steps sure and steady in the dark. "The land is a part of it," he said, "but it is not just the dirt, the rock. To my people, this place has a memory. The spirits of our ancestors are in that wind. Their stories are in the shape of those bluffs. When we walk here, we are not alone." He paused, his gaze sweeping the star-filled sky. "Home is not a roof over your head. It is the place where your spirit is known. Pike does not just want to take the land, he wants to erase its memory." He fell silent, and Ellie felt the profound weight of his words, the deep, aching sorrow of a man watching his entire world being unwritten. "And what about you?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Why do you stay? This is not your home. You risk everything for a people who do not want you and for a school that may not exist next week." She thought of the brick house in Philadelphia, of the green lawns and the predictable seasons. It was a comfortable place, a safe place, but it had never felt like home. "Home," she said softly, thinking of the faces of her students, of Natan's fierce curiosity and the O'Rourke girl's shy smile. Home is the sound of children laughing while they learn. It is a room, any room, where people from different worlds can sit together and discover they are not so different after all. "It is not a place I came from. It is a place I am trying to build." He looked at her then, and in the deep darkness, she could not read his expression, but she felt the intensity of his gaze. He understood, though their definitions were born of different worlds, one of preservation and one of creation. They were both fighting for the same essential thing, a sanctuary. They reached a place where the creek bed widened and they had to climb the bank to continue. The railroad work camp was a mile ahead, a few scattered lights visible against the dark horizon. The danger was closer now, more real. They could hear the distant clang of a hammer on steel, a sound that carried for miles in the clear night air. Ellie's heart was beating a fast, nervous rhythm. She reached into the pocket of her dress and her fingers closed around the soft, familiar fabric of her mother's handkerchief. She pulled it out. The sky-blue color was invisible in the darkness, but she could feel the delicate embroidered flowers under her thumb. She stepped in front of Chaska, stopping him, in this moment, under the immense and indifferent sky, surrounded by a danger that could consume them both. She was guided by an impulse that came from a place deeper than thought. "Wait," she whispered. She took his hand. His skin was warm, his hand strong and calloused. She carefully unfolded the blue handkerchief and, with trembling fingers, she began to tie it around his wrist. The cloth was a whisper of color, of hope, against his dark skin. "What is this for?" he asked, his voice a low vibration that she felt through her fingertips. She finished the knot, her touch lingering for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "It is so you remember the way back," she said. He did not pull away. He stood perfectly still, allowing the small, intimate gesture, this unspoken promise. He looked down at the pale cloth on his wrist, and then his gaze rose to meet hers. The space between them was charged with everything they had not said, with the shared journey through the darkness, with the dawning recognition of a spirit in the other that matched their own. Then he gave a slow, solemn nod, and they turned to face the distant, dangerous lights of the railroad. The approach to the railroad work camp was a journey into the belly of the beast. The distant, rhythmic clang of steel on steel grew louder, a relentless, mechanical heartbeat that felt alien to the sleeping prairie. Chaska led Eleanor through a shallow ravine that offered the last stretch of cover, bringing them to the edge of a stand of rustling cottonwood trees. From there, they could see the camp itself, a chaotic collection of tents, wagons, and half-finished structures, all illuminated by the harsh, flickering glare of several large bonfires. Men moved through the light like moths, their voices coarse and their laughter rough. The supply cabin stood apart from the main camp, closer to the trees where they hid. It was a small, solidly built structure of freshly cut pine logs, a solitary outpost guarding the railroad's secrets. A single lantern hung from a nail by its door, casting a lonely circle of yellow light that swayed and danced in the ceaseless wind. A lone guard sat on a stool, leaning back against the cabin wall, a rifle resting across his lap. They waited. The wind was their ally, its constant sighing masking the small sounds of their presence, its chill a sharp and constant reminder of their exposure, for what felt like an eternity. They watched the guard. He shifted on his stool, spat into the dust, and stared out at the darkness. Finally, another man emerged from the camp, carrying 2 steaming mugs. He gave one to the guard, and the 2 men spoke for a few minutes before the second man trudged back to the fires. The guard, now alone again, drank his coffee, his vigilance softened by the warmth of the mug and the monotony of his watch. After a time, his head began to nod. "Now," Chaska whispered, his voice a mere breath of sound. He moved from the trees with a swift, silent purpose, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. Ellie's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the vast quiet. She watched, her breath held tight in her chest, as Chaska circled around the cabin, using the deep darkness at its back as his path. The guard's head slumped forward onto his chest. Chaska was at the corner of the cabin now, a darker shape against the log wall. He paused, then melted around the edge and into the light. One moment the guard was dozing on his stool, the next, he was slumping silently to the ground, Chaska's arm having applied a swift and certain pressure to his neck. He was not dead, merely unconscious. Chaska dragged him into the deep shadows at the side of the cabin and took his key. A moment later, he was at the door, gesturing for her to come. Ellie ran, her feet seeming to fly over the hard, packed earth, her entire being focused on the dark rectangle of the open doorway. She slipped inside, and Chaska followed, closing the door behind them until only a sliver of light remained. The world was suddenly reduced to this small, dark space. It smelled intensely of pine resin, a clean, sharp scent that was strangely comforting. Chaska moved to the single grimy window and peered out, watching the camp. "Find it," he said, his voice a low command. Ellie's eyes adjusted to the gloom. The cabin was larger inside than it appeared. Stacks of lumber and kegs of railroad spikes lined one wall. On a long table in the center of the room, survey maps were held down at the corners by rocks. In a corner, a simple wooden cot with a single coarse wool blanket stood as a stark testament to the lonely lives of the men who worked here. This, she thought with a sudden, strange pang, was the forbidden bed. She moved to the table, her hands shaking as she examined the papers. They were technical documents, filled with numbers and angles, meaningless to her. She began a systematic search, moving as quietly as she could. She checked crates, looked under the cot, and ran her hands along the rough wooden shelves. The wind found its way through the chinks in the log walls, a cold and lonely finger tracing its way down her spine. The fear she had been holding at bay began to creep in, a chilling dampness that had nothing to do with the night air. The reality of their situation settled upon her with a crushing weight. They were trespassers, thieves in the eyes of the law. They were alone, miles from any hope of help, surrounded by rough men who would not hesitate to harm them. The ideals that had driven her here felt thin and fragile in this place of raw, masculine power. She was just a woman, a schoolteacher from a world of books and polite conversation, and she was terribly, terribly afraid. A shudder ran through her, a violent, uncontrollable tremor. She wrapped her arms around herself, but it did not help. The cold was inside her now. Chaska turned from the window, his attention drawn by the small sound her trembling had made. He saw her standing in the center of the room, her face pale in the gloom, her body shaking. He moved to the cot, picked up the rough wool blanket, and walked over to her. He did not speak. He simply draped it over her shoulders. The material was scratchy, and it smelled of pine and trail dust, but it was heavy, a tangible weight against the formless terror that gripped her. His hands rested on her shoulders for a moment, his touch firm and steadying through the thick wool. But the simple act of kindness broke something inside her. A sob escaped her throat, a small, choked sound. The life she had known, the proper protected world of Eleanor Whitford, had been a kind of sleep, and now she was awake, raw and exposed in a world she did not understand. All the emotion she had suppressed, the fear from the ambush, the fury at Dwyer, the despair over her failing school, all of it rose up in a suffocating wave. He did not move away. He remained in front of her, a solid and silent presence in the dark. "I have never," she whispered, her voice ragged and broken, "I have never felt so alone." Her entire life had been a performance of strength, of composure. She was the responsible one, the brave one. But it was a lie. Underneath it all was an innocence she had never acknowledged, a profound inexperience not just of the body, but of the heart. She had never allowed herself to truly feel anything, not love, not fear, not this deep, aching need for another human soul to see her, to truly see her, in the dark. In that desperate moment of utter solitude and overwhelming fear, she shed the last of her defenses. She looked up at him, at his stoic face, at the profound stillness in his eyes that seemed to have witnessed all the world's sorrows. She saw not a savage, not an outcast, but a man who understood what it meant to be alone, and she wanted, for just a single, fleeting moment, to bridge that gulf, to feel the warmth of another life against the cold certainty of her own mortality. Her voice was a thread of sound, trembling but resolute. "Let me feel you once." The words hung in the air, a plea of such stark and simple vulnerability that it silenced the wind itself. It was the request of a virgin, not for the taking of a prize, but for the sharing of a truth. It was a prayer to feel something real in a world that had become a nightmare of lies. Chaska looked at her, and in his eyes there was no surprise, no judgment. There was only a deep and solemn understanding. He had seen her courage, her defiance, her kindness, and now he saw her fear, her profound loneliness. He reached out, not with haste, but with a slow, deliberate tenderness, and took her hand. He led her the few steps to the corner of the room, to the simple cot that waited in the shadows. He gently drew her down to sit on its edge, then settled beside her. Then, the Lakota warrior pulled her against him, wrapping his arms around her as he drew her fully onto the narrow, forbidden bed. It was not an act of passion, but of sanctuary. He did not kiss her. He simply held her. He was a shield against the cold wind that seeped through the walls, a solid anchor in the terrifying darkness. He held her with a strength that was meant not to possess, but to protect. And Ellie, pressed against the unyielding warmth of his body, finally stopped shaking. She laid her head on his shoulder, breathing in the scent of smoke and leather in the wild prairie, and for the first time in her life, she did not feel alone. It was an embrace that respected every boundary, yet crossed the most important one of all. In that shared silence, Chaska learned to trust in a future that might include another, and Ellie found the strength to face the storm. After a long time, he released her, and they stood up, the spell broken but not forgotten. They were a team now, bound by something deeper than a shared goal. They returned to the search, their movements synchronized and efficient. It was Ellie who found it. Tucked away inside a crate stenciled with the words "Oats for Survey Mules" was a smaller, locked metal box. Chaska took a crowbar from a nearby tool pile and, with a single sharp grunt of effort, pried the lid open. Inside, nestled amongst ordinary shipping manifests, was a leather-bound ledger. Ellie took it to the sliver of light coming from the door. She opened it. Her breath caught in her throat. It was exactly as Chaska had predicted. Column after column of meticulous entries, all in Pike's neat, precise hand. There were names she recognized from the town council next to dates and dollar amounts. There was a large payment recorded to Caleb Dwyer on the day after the faked ambush, and on every page, stamped in purple ink, was the diamond logo of the Platte and Northern Railroad. Tucked in the back of the ledger was a sheaf of contracts, deeds transferring ownership of land from local settlers to the railroad, many of them signed with the shaky, uncertain mark of men who could not write their own names. "We have it," she breathed. "We have him." As the words left her lips, a new sound cut through the wind, the steady, rhythmic beat of approaching horses, not the wandering gait of a patrol, but the purposeful pace of riders who knew exactly where they were going. Chaska was at the window in an instant. "Dwyer," he said, his voice a low growl, and two of his men. Panic, cold and absolute, seized Ellie. They were trapped. The cabin was a box, and the lid was about to be slammed shut. Chaska's eyes darted around the small space, searching, calculating. He stomped his foot on the floorboards near the cot. One of the boards gave a hollow echo. He dropped to his knees, his fingers finding the edge of a crudely cut trapdoor. He pulled it open, revealing a square of utter blackness and the damp, earthy smell of a small coal cellar. "Go," he commanded, pushing the ledger and the contracts into her hands. She did not hesitate. She swung her legs into the opening, her feet finding the top rung of a small, rickety ladder. The space was tiny, cramped, and smelled of coal dust and spiders. Chaska handed down the metal box, then slipped into the hole after her, pulling the trapdoor shut over their heads. They were plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. As he settled the door into place, his boot dislodged a small clump of fresh mud from the lip of the opening, and it fell to the floor of the cabin above, a dark, damp stain on the dusty wood. Above them, they heard the horses pull to a halt, the creak of saddle leather, heavy boots hitting the ground. A fist hammered on the cabin door. "Pike!" a gruff voice called out. It was Dwyer. "Open up. We need to talk." Silence. Then the sound of a key in the lock, the same key Chaska had used. The cabin door creaked open. Heavy footsteps entered the room, stopping just a few feet above their heads. They held their breath, clutching the evidence, their bodies pressed together in the cold, dark earth. The heavy bootsteps of Marshal Caleb Dwyer echoed on the floorboards just inches above their heads, each tread a hammer blow against the fragile silence of the cellar. Eleanor Whitford and Chaska stood pressed together in the absolute darkness, the cold, damp earth at their backs, and the stolen ledger clutched in Ellie's hands like a prayer book. They could hear the low murmur of voices, Dwyer's gruff bark and the uncertain replies of his deputies. "He is not here," one of the deputies said. "The guard is out cold, but Pike is gone." Dwyer cursed, a low and vicious sound. "Look around. Someone has been in here. The box is busted open." There was the sound of objects being thrown, of crates being kicked aside. Ellie's heart hammered so violently she was certain they could hear it through the floor. She could feel the steady, calm rhythm of Chaska's breathing beside her, an anchor in the terrifying dark. He put a hand on her arm, a silent command to remain perfectly still. "What is this?" Dwyer's voice was suddenly closer, directly above the trap door. There was a pause. "Mud. It is still wet." Ellie's blood ran cold. The small clump of mud Chaska's boot had dislodged. Such a tiny, careless thing. A fatal betrayal. They heard the scrape of a boot heel on the floor. Then the sound of the trapdoor being lifted. A rectangle of dim, yellow light fell into the cellar, blinding them for a second. Dwyer's face, shadowed and menacing, peered down into the darkness. His eyes had not yet adjusted. For a heartbeat, he saw nothing. It was all the time Chaska needed. He moved with explosive force, shoving Ellie behind him and surging up the ladder. He did not climb. He launched himself upward, his shoulder crashing into Dwyer's chest as the marshal was still trying to bring his pistol to bear. Dwyer roared in surprise and pain, stumbling backward, the pistol flying from his grasp and clattering across the floor. Chaska was out of the cellar and in the cabin, a blur of motion. He kicked the legs out from under one deputy and used the man's momentum to send him crashing into the other. Before they could recover, he was out the door and gone, melting into the deep darkness of the cottonwood grove. "Run!" His voice came back to them, a low, urgent command carried on the wind. Dwyer, enraged, scrambled for his gun. Ellie did not wait. She clambered up the ladder, the heavy ledger clutched to her chest, and bolted for the door. One of the deputies made a grab for her, his fingers brushing her sleeve, but she wrenched away and ran, her lungs burning, her only thought to follow the path Chaska had taken. They did not stop until they were miles away, hidden deep in the folds of the prairie. The lights of the work camp a faint, angry glow on the horizon. They had the evidence, but their victory felt hollow. They were now fugitives. They had not merely witnessed a crime, they had committed one. The return to Cottonwood Creek was a nightmare of stealth and fear. They arrived just before sunrise, two weary ghosts slipping through the silent streets. They went directly to the parsonage, Reverend Hale, already awake for his morning prayers. Let them in. His face a mixture of terror and resolve when he saw the book in Ellie's hands. A few minutes later, summoned by a prearranged signal, May Collins and a grim-faced O'Rourke joined them, the blacksmith's head now wrapped in a clean white bandage. In the dim light of the Reverend's study, they laid out the truth. Ellie opened the ledger, her finger tracing the lines of Pike's neat, damning script. She showed them the payments to Dwyer, the bribes to the councilmen, the coerced land deeds. The room was silent, the air thick with the weight of the conspiracy they had unearthed. "Pike will not wait," Chaska said, breaking the silence. "He knows we have this. He will move now, before we can use it." He was right. By mid-morning, Silas Pike had seized the narrative. He stood on the porch of the general store, his voice ringing with manufactured outrage. He spoke of a brazen attack on his company's property, of a guard left for dead, of a conspiracy between a dangerous renegade and a hysterical, misguided schoolteacher. To protect the town, to secure the territory for law-abiding citizens. He announced the Platte and Northern Railroad, in cooperation with the marshal's office, was moving up the public land auction. It would be held the very next day. It was a brilliant, ruthless move. He was using their crime as his justification, twisting the truth into a weapon. Just before noon, a thunderous explosion shook the entire town, rattling windows and sending a plume of black smoke into the clear blue sky from the direction of the rail line. People poured into the street, their faces pale with fear. Dwyer and his deputies were already on their horses, galloping toward the smoke. It was a perfectly timed piece of theater. An hour later, they returned, dragging 3 Lakota men behind their horses with ropes. One of them was Natan's uncle. They had been on their way to town to trade, but that no longer mattered. They were the designated villains. They tried to blow the track. Dwyer roared to the assembled crowd. "An act of war. We caught them red-handed." He pointed a finger at the silent, dignified prisoners. "This is what their kind understands. Violence. But we will show them what American justice looks like. They will be put on the midnight freight train and shipped to the federal prison at Fort Laramie." The crowd, already primed with fear and suspicion, murmured its approval. Pike watched from the edge of the crowd, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. The final pieces of his plan were falling into place. Back in the parsonage, the small band of conspirators knew they were out of time. Their quiet planning session had become a council of war. "I need to get to the prisoners," Chaska said, his voice low and intense. "Natan's family is among them. I will not let them be sent away on a lie." "It is a trap," May warned. "Dwyer will be expecting you." "It is a trap I must walk into," he replied. "While you do that, we will set one of our own," May said, her eyes flashing with a hard, practical light. She turned to the others, her voice crisp with command. "Reverend, you must call a town meeting. Use the evening service, anything. Get the people to the church. Tell them you have a matter of grave importance to discuss. When the time is right, you will read from this book." Reverend Hale, who had been pale and trembling, seemed to find a new strength in the face of this direct command. His spine straightened. "I will," he said, his voice firm. "I will not let God's house be a haven for cowards." May then looked at O'Rourke. "Blacksmith, can you still work?" The big Irishman touched the bandage on his head and gave a grim smile. "My hands are fine," he said, "and they are itching for something to do." "Good," May said. "Dwyer's men will ride after Chaska when he makes his move. I want you to make sure their horses do not get very far." O'Rourke's smile widened. "It would be my pleasure." That left Ellie. "Your job is the hardest," May told her, her voice softening slightly. "You must be the one to give the signal. You will stay near the church. When Chaska has the prisoners free, he will find a way to let you know. Then you will tell the Reverend to begin. The timing must be perfect." The rest of the day passed in a blur of tense preparation. May disappeared into the smoky depths of the saloon, with a combination of old loyalties, veiled threats, and the promise of future credit. She spoke to the girls who worked there. She learned that 2 of them had seen Dwyer's deputies unloading sacks from a railroad wagon late one night. The same night the hoods were found in the line shack. They had thought nothing of it at the time, but now, with May's pointed questions, they were prepared to swear to what they saw. In his forge, the rhythmic clang of O'Rourke's hammer took on a new, more sinister rhythm. He was not making horseshoes or mending wagon wheels. He was heating and hammering rods of iron, cutting and twisting them into small, vicious, 4-spiked stars, caltrops, an ancient tool of defense designed to stop a cavalry charge in its tracks. Each one he dropped into a bucket of water hissed like an angry snake. As dusk fell, Reverend Hale walked to the church and began to ring the bell, its solemn, tolling call echoing out over the anxious town, summoning the faithful and the curious alike. The midnight freight train was a long, dark serpent breathing steam into the cold night air. It sat on a siding a half-mile from town, waiting to take on its human cargo. Chaska moved through the darkness like a ghost, the blue handkerchief, his only spot of color, still tied to his wrist. He slipped under wagons and between piles of railroad ties. His destination, the single, windowless boxcar that stood apart from the rest of the train. He scaled the side of the car, as silent as a climbing cat, and worked on the heavy latch on the roof hatch. Inside, he found what he expected. The 3 Lakota men, including Natan's uncle, were bound and gagged in one corner, their faces bruised but their eyes defiant, and huddled in the other corner, also tied up, was Natan himself. Dwyer had taken him, to a final, cruel twist of the knife, a hostage to ensure his family's compliance. Chaska worked quickly, his knife flashing in the gloom as he cut their bonds. He spoke to them in low, urgent Lakota, explaining the plan. They were to wait for his signal. But Dwyer, as May had predicted, was not a fool. He had been expecting trouble. As Chaska prepared to lead the prisoners out, the heavy side door of the boxcar slid open with a deafening screech. The marshal stood silhouetted against the night, a lantern in one hand and a shotgun in the other. "I knew you would come," Dwyer snarled, the lantern light glinting in his cold eyes. "It ends here." He raised the shotgun, but Notton's uncle, now free, threw himself at the marshal's legs. The shotgun discharged with a deafening roar, the blast tearing a hole in the roof of the boxcar but missing its target. In that instant of confusion, Chaska launched himself at Dwyer, not to kill, but to disarm. The two men crashed out of the open door and onto the gravel track bed beside the train. The shotgun skittered away into the darkness. The lantern fell and shattered, plunging them into a chaos of shadows and steam from the engine. It was not a gunfight. It was a brutal, desperate struggle. Dwyer was bigger and heavier, a beast of a man fueled by rage and whiskey. But Chaska was quicker, stronger, his muscles honed by a life lived on the edge of survival. They grappled on the tracks, their panting breaths mixing with the hiss of the locomotive. It was a fight for more than their lives. It was a wrestling match between two opposing forces, the marshal's brutal, corrupt power and Chaska's unyielding honor. The cold, unbending iron of the railroad track, that symbol of Pike's manifest destiny, was the floor of their arena, a line drawn between civilization and the wilderness, a razor's edge on which the fate of Cottonwood Creek was about to be decided. The raw, brutal struggle on the gravel track bed was a fight unburdened by rules or honor. Marshal Caleb Dwyer was a cornered bear, all brute force and roaring fury, his fists like sledgehammers. But Chaska moved like water, yielding and then striking, using the marshal's own clumsy momentum against him. They rolled and grappled in the dirt and steam, the hiss of the locomotive a constant, menacing whisper in the night. Dwyer managed to land a heavy blow to Chaska's ribs, drawing a sharp gasp of pain, but in that same moment, Chaska twisted, locking his legs around the marshal's and sending them both to the ground. Chaska was up first. He did not press the attack. He scooped up the discarded shotgun and, with a powerful swing, smashed its stock against the iron of the railroad track. The wood splintered with a sharp crack, rendering the weapon useless. He threw the ruined gun into the darkness, a final, definitive statement. The fight was over. He turned and disappeared into the shadows to free the prisoners. Back in Cottonwood Creek, the church was filled to capacity. The flickering lamplight cast long, dancing shadows on the faces of the townspeople, painting them with a mixture of piety, curiosity, and a low, simmering anxiety. They had come for Reverend Hale's evening service, but the tension in the air was anything but holy. It felt like the charged, heavy stillness before a thunderstorm. Silas Pike stood near the back, his arms crossed, a confident, proprietary smile on his face. He was the master of this town, and this was merely a final, formal acknowledgement of his control. Eleanor Whitford stood in the vestibule, the cold leather of the ledger a heavy, solid weight in her hands. She strained her ears, listening for a signal over the restless shuffling and coughing of the congregation. Every gust of wind sounded like a hoofbeat, every distant dog's bark like a gunshot. Her heart was a frantic bird trapped in the cage of her ribs. Then she heard it. A single horse, ridden hard from the east, its gallop a desperate, frantic rhythm against the hard-packed earth. The rider did not stop, did not shout. He was one of the freed Lakota men. He simply thundered past the church, a fleeting shadow against the starlight, and disappeared down the main street. It was enough. It was the signal. Ellie pushed through the inner doors and walked down the central aisle, her footsteps echoing in the sudden, expectant silence. She did not look at the faces that turned to watch her. Her eyes were fixed on the Reverend, who stood nervously behind the simple wooden pulpit. She reached him, placed the ledger on the worn surface of the Bible stand, and gave a single, sharp nod. Reverend Hale looked down at the book, then out at the sea of faces before him. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the breath of a man about to step off a cliff. "My friends, my neighbors," he began, his voice shaking but carrying to every corner of the crowded room. "I have not called you here tonight to speak of Scripture. I have called you here to speak of sin, not the sins of the Spirit, but the sins of greed and deceit that are poisoning our town." A confused murmur rippled through the congregation. At the back, Silas Pike's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold, murderous fury. He saw the ledger, and he understood. The Reverend opened the book. His finger, trembling slightly, found the first entry. He began to read. A payment of $50 to Councilman Miller for his vote on the new water ordinance. The councilman, a portly man with a perpetually worried expression, turned a shade of pale green. The Reverend read another $100 to Marshal Caleb Dwyer, paid on the day following the alleged attack on Miss Whitford. The murmuring grew louder, angrier. People turned to look at Pike, their expressions shifting from respect to suspicion. Pike's hand slipped inside his tailored coat. He began to push his way through the crowd, his eyes locked on the Reverend. "It is all lies," he shouted, his voice a sharp, ugly tear in the fabric of the evening. "Lies concocted by a traitor and a hysterical woman. Marshal, do your duty." As if on cue, the church doors burst open. Marshal Dwyer, his face bruised and his clothes torn, stood there, a pistol in his hand. His remaining deputies fanned out behind him. The trap was closing. The town's last hope was about to be extinguished by brute force in the house of God. "Stop him," Dwyer roared, pointing his pistol at the Reverend. But as his deputies took their first step down the aisle, a sound unlike any other ripped through the night. It was not a gunshot. It was a cataclysmic, deafening crash, a sound of immense, groaning metal and splintering wood that shook the very foundations of the church. The great bronze bell, the one that had called them to weddings and warned them of fires for 20 years, had fallen from the belfry, plunging to the street below. It landed with the force of a thunderbolt, its last, mournful, earth-shaking bong a death knell for the old order. The crowd cried out in terror and confusion. In the belfry high above, O'Rourke the blacksmith dropped the axe he had used to sever the thick rope, a grim smile on his face. The chaos was the signal for May Collins. Now she yelled to the women around her, "Get the children out." She and the other women of the town, from the store owner's wife to the girls from the saloon, formed a human chain. They did not panic. They moved with a fierce, protective purpose, herding the bewildered men and frightened children out the side doors, away from the impending confrontation, clearing a space for the final act. Into this maelstrom of dust, fear, and confusion, a new figure appeared. Chaska rode his painted pony into the square of light cast by the open church doors. He was not an avenging angel. He was something more powerful. He was the living truth. And riding in front of him, his small arms wrapped tightly around Chaska's waist, was Natan, alive and safe. The sight of the boy broke the spell of Pike's lies. The people of Cottonwood Creek, the ones who had whispered and feared and allowed themselves to be manipulated, saw with their own eyes the proof of the conspiracy. They saw the kidnapped child, returned not by the law, but by the man the law had condemned. Dwyer, his face a mask of pure, murderous rage, turned from the church and stumbled into the street. He had lost control, lost his authority, lost everything. All he had left was the gun in his hand. He raised it, his arm shaking with fury, and aimed it at Chaska. "This ends now," he screamed. Chaska sat calmly on his horse, the boy held securely before him. He did not reach for a weapon. He simply watched the marshal, his gaze steady and unwavering. It was not a contest of speed. It was a contest of will. Dwyer fired, a wild, panicked shot that went wide, kicking up a spray of dirt a dozen feet from the horse. In the ensuing chaos, one of his own deputies, caught up in the madness, also drew his pistol and fired blindly into the crowd. A man. One of the ranchers who had been considering selling his land to Pike cried out and fell, clutching his arm. Seeing the wounded man, seeing the innocent blood spilled, something shifted in Chaska. He moved, but not with the explosive speed of a gunfighter. His motion was fluid, economical, and precise. His hand went to the pistol at his hip, a weapon he carried but rarely used. He drew and fired in a single, seamless motion. The shot was not aimed at Dwyer's heart or his head. It was aimed at his hand. The bullet struck with surgical precision. Dwyer screamed, a high, thin sound of agony as the bones in his right hand shattered. His pistol flew from his grasp, spinning through the air before clattering uselessly to the ground. He staggered back, clutching his ruined hand. His reign of terror ended not with a bang, but with the sound of breaking bone. Ellie, who had run from the church in the wake of the crowd, saw the rancher fall. Without a thought, she ran to his side. She ripped a strip of fabric from her petticoat to make a bandage. But then her eyes fell on Chaska, who had dismounted and was calming his horse. The small sky-blue handkerchief was still tied to his wrist. Their eyes met across the chaotic square. He saw the wounded man, saw the desperate need in her expression. He held out his arm. She ran to him, and with trembling fingers, she untied the knot. She took her mother's symbol of hope, now stained with the dust of their journey, and ran back to the wounded man. She pressed the cloth to the bleeding wound, her small act of healing a quiet counterpoint to the violence that had just transpired. During the standoff, Silas Pike saw his chance. His world had collapsed in the space of 10 minutes. His authority was gone, his conspiracy exposed. He turned and ran, not toward his horse, but down a dark alleyway between the general store and the blacksmith's forge, a shortcut to the open prairie and escape. He ran with the desperate speed of a trapped animal. His frantic escape ended abruptly. His feet hit something sharp, something that did not belong in the dirt of the alley. He cried out, a sharp yelp of pain, as the four-pointed iron spikes of O'Rourke's caltrops pierced the thin leather of his city boots. He stumbled and fell hard, his hands scraping on the rough ground. He tried to rise, but his ankles were a mess of pain and blood. Before he could crawl away, shadows filled the mouth of the alley. It was not the law, it was the town. O'Rourke stood there, his hammer held loosely in one hand. The store owner was beside him, his face grim. The ranchers Pike had tried to cheat, the councilmen he had bribed. They were all there. They did not shout. They did not threaten. They simply stood there, blocking his escape, their silent judgment more terrifying than any weapon. His power had been an illusion, built on their fear and division. Now, united, they were taking it back. The fight for Cottonwood Creek was over. The aftermath of the confrontation in the town square was not a celebration. A heavy, exhausted silence settled over Cottonwood Creek, the kind of quiet that follows a fever breaking. The townsfolk did not cheer. They stood in the dust and the flickering lamplight, looking at the evidence of the night's violence, the shattered bell lying in the street like a fallen god, the dark patch of blood where the rancher had been shot, the disgraced marshal clutching his ruined hand, and the railroad man, Silas Pike, sitting defeated in an alley, his escape thwarted by a blacksmith's simple, brutal ingenuity. The air, which had been thick with lies and fear, was now clear and cold with a terrible, sober truth. It was O'Rourke, the blacksmith, who took charge. He was not a man of law, but he was a man of unshakable moral gravity. He, along with two of the ranchers Pike had tried to swindle, disarmed Dwyer's remaining deputies, who offered no resistance. The badges were stripped from their chests and dropped unceremoniously in the dust. Dwyer himself, whimpering in pain, was taken not to his own cell, but to the small room at the back of the doctor's office to have his shattered hand set. A guard, one of the ranchers, was posted at his door. They brought Silas Pike out of the alley. His tailored suit was torn and filthy, his face a mask of disbelief. He blustered and threatened, speaking of lawyers and the power of the Platte and Northern Railroad, but his words were empty. The ledger, now held securely by Reverend Hale, had stripped him of his authority. He was just a man in a dusty town who had been caught cheating. They locked him in the other cell in the marshal's office, the one that still smelled of Chaska's brief, unjust confinement. The next few days were a strange and uncertain interlude. News traveled slowly in the territory, but it also traveled with the weight of consequence. May Collins, using the same network of debts and favors that had secured Chaska's release, sent a rider to the territorial capital. The rider carried two things: a letter from May detailing the events, and a sworn, signed testimony from Reverend Hale, corroborated by O'Rourke and a dozen other townsfolk. The response was swift and decisive. A week later, a federal marshal, a grim, eagle-faced man who seemed unimpressed by everything, arrived on the stagecoach. He spent 2 days asking quiet questions, his pen scratching away in a small notebook. He reviewed Pike's ledger, interviewed the saloon girls May had found, and listened to the Lakota men Chaska had freed. He officially relieved Caleb Dwyer of his duties and placed him under federal arrest, to be tried not just for conspiracy, but for the illegal imprisonment of Nathan. Silas Pike was charged with a litany of crimes, from fraud and extortion to inciting violence. The Platte and Northern Railroad, in a hastily printed statement that appeared in a Cheyenne newspaper a week after that, disavowed all of Pike's actions, calling him a rogue agent who had acted far outside his authority. The company announced that the Cottonwood Creek line was suspended indefinitely, pending a full federal investigation. The Iron Serpent had been stopped, at least for now. The town, in the absence of its corrupt authority, had to learn to govern itself. An emergency council was formed, with O'Rourke, Reverend Hale, and one of the senior ranchers at its head. Their first official act was to offer a formal apology to the Lakota families who had been driven from the willow thicket, inviting them to return. Their second was to reaffirm Eleanor Whitford's teaching contract. The school reopened on a Monday morning, under a sky that seemed wider and brighter than before. The air was still and cool, the first hint of autumn in the wind. And this time, the benches were full, not just the children of her allies, but all the children. The son of the storekeeper sat next to one of the Lakota girls he had once stared at with suspicion. Nathan was back, his curious eyes brighter than ever, and he sat beside a boy whose father had been one of Dwyer's deputies. The silence in the room was different now. It was not the heavy silence of mistrust, but the shy, awkward quiet of strangers learning to become neighbors. They were all children of the same harsh, beautiful land, and they were all survivors of the same storm. Ellie stood before them, her heart so full it felt as though it might burst. She had washed the sky-blue handkerchief, scrubbing away the blood of the wounded rancher and the dust of their desperate journey. It was faded now, the blue a little paler, the threads of the forget-me-nots a little frayed, like a flag that had weathered a long and difficult battle. Before the children arrived that morning, she had taken it and hung it from the nail on the outside of the church door, a small patch of blue against the weathered gray wood. It was not a personal memento anymore. It was a sign. This place was a sanctuary. All were welcome. She knew that teaching them the alphabet was not enough. They had to learn a new language, the language of mutual respect. That afternoon, she sent the children home with invitations, written in her neatest script. She invited all the mothers of the town, from the boarding house and the clapboard houses and the teepees by the willow thicket, to a potluck gathering at the church the following Sunday. The day of the gathering was bright and clear. The women came, hesitant at first, each carrying a dish that told a story. The store owner's wife, the same woman who had once publicly condemned Ellie, brought a large apple pie, its crust a perfect golden brown. Nathan's mother brought a savory stew of rabbit and wild turnips. May Collins brought a formidable platter of fried chicken, and the ranchers' wives brought fresh-baked bread and jars of preserved berries. They laid the food out on the long benches, a silent, edible peace treaty. There was no grand ceremony, there were no speeches, there was only the slow, cautious process of sharing a meal. Ellie watched as the store owner's wife cut a large slice of her pie and, after a moment's hesitation, walked over and offered it to Natan's mother. The Lakota woman, in turn, ladled some of her rich stew into a bowl for the other woman's son. Small gestures, fragile bridges built across a chasm of prejudice. They began to talk, not about land or laws, but about the things all mothers talk about: the difficulty of a child's cough, the challenges of a long winter, the shared hope for a better future. They spoke of the cattle and the rivers, of the way the land provided and the way it took away. They were discovering, word by word, bite by bite, a common ground. Chaska did not attend the gathering. It was not his place, but he watched it from his customary spot on the ridge, a distant, solitary figure. He saw the women talking. He saw the children, his own nephew among them, chasing each other in a game that had no name and no rules, their laughter carrying on the clean, cool air. He had spent his life protecting the past, defending the memory of his people from a world that sought to erase it. He had believed that the only way to survive was to stand apart, to guard the boundaries. But as he watched Ellie move among the people, her face luminous with a hope that was no longer naive but tempered and strong, he felt something shift inside him. He had seen her terror in the dark cabin, and he had seen her courage in the town square. She fought not with weapons, but with a fierce and unyielding belief in the possibility of goodness. She did not seek to conquer, she sought to build. And for the first time, Chaska allowed himself to imagine a different kind of future. He began to see that a home might not have to be a fortress, a place to hide from the world. Perhaps a home could be a place where two worlds met, where the stories of the rivers and the lessons of the school book could be told in the same breath. It was a fragile, dangerous thought, a seedling pushing its way through the hard, packed earth of his grief. But as he looked at the small patch of blue fluttering on the church door, a symbol of her world that he had worn on his own skin, the seedling felt like it might just have a chance to grow. The rains came not with the sudden, violent fury of a prairie thunderstorm, but gently, almost hesitantly, in the dark of a mid-autumn night. It began as a soft whisper on the roof of the boarding house, a sound so unfamiliar that Eleanor Whitford, lying awake in her narrow bed, thought at first it was the wind carrying sand against the glass, but the sound persisted, growing from a whisper to a steady, rhythmic drumming. It was the sound of a promise being kept. By morning, the world was transformed. The red dust that had coated everything, that had lived in their lungs and lined their throats for months, was gone, replaced by a deep, rich, earthy brown. The air, stripped of its grit, was clean and cool and carried the intoxicating scent of wet soil and damp sagebrush. The whole of Cottonwood Creek seemed to exhale a long, collective sigh of relief. But a single rainfall, however welcome, could not erase a season of drought. The town well was replenished, but the land itself was still thirsty, the deeper springs still dormant. The fragile peace that had settled over the community needed to be nurtured, just like the parched earth. It needed a common purpose, a shared task to solidify the tentative bonds forged in the heat of conflict. The idea came, as most practical ideas did, from O'Rourke, standing by the hand pump he had built over the small, muddy seep Chaska had found. He watched the water trickle out, a meager offering from the wounded land. "This is not enough," he said to the small group that had gathered, his voice a low rumble. "That spring Chaska found is an old one, a strong one, but it is being choked. If we were to dig it out proper, give it a clear channel to run, it would give us all the water we could ever need." It was a monumental task, one that would have been impossible for a divided town. But this was a new Cottonwood Creek. The next morning, a procession of figures made its way to the willow thicket. It was not a posse, not a faction, it was the town. O'Rourke came with shovels and picks from his forge. Reverend Hale arrived, his sleeves already rolled up. The storekeeper, whose wife had once been Ellie's most vocal critic, came with his son. They were joined by the ranchers and their hands, men who understood the vital importance of water better than anyone. And from the other direction, from their newly re-established camp, came the Lakota. Natan's uncle led them, his face still bearing the faint marks of his ordeal, but his eyes clear and steady. Chaska was with them, not as a leader, but as one of them, a shovel resting on his shoulder. Ellie brought her students. This, she had decided, was a lesson that could not be taught on a slate. This was a lesson in building, in community, in the simple, profound truth that everyone, regardless of the color of their skin or the language they spoke, gets thirsty. They worked under Chaska's quiet guidance. He knew the land, knew its secret contours, the way the water wanted to flow. He showed them where to dig the main channel, a gentle, curving path that followed the lowest ground. The work was hard. The sun was warm on their backs, and the air filled with the rhythmic scrape and crunch of shovels biting into the damp earth. There were no grand speeches, no declarations of unity. The healing happened in the small, unspoken moments. It happened when O'Rourke, seeing Natan's uncle struggling to lift a heavy rock, moved to his side and they lifted it together. A shared grunt of effort, their only communication. It happened when the storekeeper's wife brought a bucket of cool, clean water from the well and offered the dipper first to a Lakota woman, who accepted it with a shy, grateful nod. Ellie watched as the children, at first separated into their familiar groups, began to mingle, drawn together by the simple, glorious fun of playing in the mud, their laughter a language they all understood. Ellie and Chaska worked side by side, their movements falling into a natural, easy rhythm. They did not speak much. They did not need to. The shared labor was a conversation in itself, a physical expression of the partnership that had been forged in darkness and danger. The ditch deepened, a long, clean scar of hope on the land. By the end of the second day, they broke through the last barrier of rock and clay that had been strangling the old spring. There was a sudden, joyful gurgle, and then the water came. It did not trickle. It flowed, clear and cold and abundant, filling the channel they had dug, its music the sweetest sound the people of Cottonwood Creek had ever heard. It ran down the gentle slope, a silver ribbon dividing, and then uniting, the two halves of their community. One branch leading toward the town's water trough, the other toward the Lakota camp. The waterway. It was a shared vein, a common lifeline for a community that was learning to be one. That evening, as the sun set, casting a golden glow on the new, life-giving stream, Chaska and Ellie walked along its freshly dug banks. The air was cool, and the sound of the running water was a peaceful, constant murmur. "This is a good place," Chaska said, his gaze following the path of the water. He stopped near a small, level patch of ground, shaded by a large cottonwood tree. A good place for the children to learn. He looked at her, his expression serious, his dark eyes holding a question that went far beyond a simple proposal. "The church is your school," he said. "It is a good place. But it is in the town. It will always be the white man's school. What if there was another, a small one? We could build it here, by the water. A place where they could learn your letters and your numbers, and a place where they could learn the stories of our people, the history of this land, from one of our own elders. A place where they would not have to choose between two worlds, but could learn to live in both." It was a radical idea, a dream of a future that no one else had dared to imagine. It was an offer of true partnership, a sharing not just of water, but of knowledge, of identity. Ellie looked at the spot he had indicated, at the way the last rays of sunlight filtered through the leaves of the cottonwood. She could almost see it, a small, sturdy building, its door open, the sound of children's voices mixing with the sound of the stream. "Yes," she said, her voice soft but certain. "Yes." On their walk back, they passed the edge of town, where the old, bleached cow skull still stood impaled on its fence post. It had been the first thing she had seen when she arrived, a grim symbol of death and survival in a harsh land. She looked at it now, and it no longer seemed menacing. It was just a part of the landscape, a relic of a past that was already beginning to feel distant. "That is a memory," Chaska said, following her gaze. "It is a reminder of the long journey, of the herds that crossed this land, of the life that came from them. It does not have to be a symbol of fear." The next day, He took the skull down from the post, together. They carried it to the stream, and using sand and water, they scrubbed it clean, washing away the years of dust and grime until the bone was a smooth, polished white. They would keep it, they decided. And when the new school was built, they would hang it over the porch. It would no longer be a warning. It would be a lesson, a fulcrum of memory, a respected piece of the past on which to build a new future. A few nights later, they walked out of town together under a canopy of brilliant stars. They did not speak of their destination, but they both knew where they were going. They followed the same path they had taken on that other, darker night. But this time they did not hide in the creek bed. They walked on the open prairie, their shoulders occasionally brushing. Two people moving as one through the vast, quiet landscape. The supply cabin at the railhead was still there, abandoned and silent, a monument to a defeated ambition. The door was unlocked. They stepped inside. The air was stale, and a thin layer of dust covered everything. But the sharp scent of pine still lingered. In the starlight filtering through the single grimy window, they could see the cot in the corner, its rough blankets still rumpled. This place was no longer forbidden. It was no longer a place of fear and secrets. It was simply a room where their lives had changed forever. They stood in the center of the cabin, the silence between them comfortable and profound. There were no grand declarations, no passionate speeches. Their story was not one of fire and noise. It was one of quiet strength, of a slow, steady, and certain coming together. Chaska reached out and took her hand. His grasp was not the desperate clutch of a lover, but the firm, warm, and encompassing hold of a partner. It was a promise, an anchor, a statement of fact. Eleanor looked down at their joined hands, his dark skin against hers, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that she had found her home. It was not a place on a map. It was here, in this quiet, unassuming strength, in this shared future. The road ahead for Cottonwood Creek would not be easy. The scars of prejudice ran deep, and the world outside their small valley was still full of greed and ambition. But the water was now flowing for everyone, a clear, clean current of hope, and in a small schoolhouse by a stream, the children were learning to read both the letters in a book and the stories in the sky of the schoolhouse and the sky of the leather drum. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are tuning in from so we can all connect, and be sure to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like this video, and press the hype button to help more people discover this tale.